Episode 1, Predictors of Performance. Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Batterson. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, folks. Today we're going to be having a discussion on the predictors of performance, and that is for endurance performance. So it's going to be your regular podcast hosts, Phil Batterson and I. We are going to do this weekly, where we kind of dig into some of the research we might think is applicable for coaches and athletes, and maybe shed some light on stuff that we think will serve the individuals in the sports performance realm well. So this is going to be one of our weekly episodes, and the other episode will be with myself, basically interviewing someone in the field, whether that's a coach, a researcher, or a expert of some sort of related sports performance concepts. So if you want to find Phil, he's at Critical02 on Instagram, puts out some really good stuff. He essentially breaks down some of the kind of nuanced literature and makes it applicable for all of us out there in the sports performance realm. So if you want to find myself on Instagram, that's at Resilience HPC. And I post there. I try to post as much as I can anyways. And so today we'll dig in. All of the papers that we discuss will be in the show notes. And that's how it's going to be for pretty much every episode. If I forget something, if I talked about a paper, or Phil talks about a paper and it's not in there, just ting us, and we'll get that out to you, or we'll chuck it back in the show notes. Today we're going to be discussing Ed Coyle's and Michael Joyner's kind of landmark paper, where they really brought forth the performance VO2 and all these things. And we kind of break it down so, people can understand what are the relevance of these things, and, should I be testing these things? What do they kind of serve a use for? So, hope you enjoy, and we'll talk to you soon.
So this whole idea of predictions of endurance performance and all that sort of stuff is something that's pretty near and dear to my heart. So when we first agreed, to talk about this, I was like, oh, this is perfect, because we have, kind of your classic paper that we'll talk about with Ed Coyle and Michael Joyner, where they kind of detail what like the predictors of performance are, and kind of the impetus behind all of this. And then there's another review that recently came out by Steven Vanderswoord, who has really been kind of doing a lot with skeletal muscle and its involvement in predictors of performance. And then my master's degree, the paper that we published out of that was actually measuring these predictors of performance, putting them into mathematical models, and then incorporating measures of skeletal muscle mitochondria and putting it into predictive measures of performance. And so I love this sort of stuff. I don't know where you want to start, because I think we can, there's so many different places, but let me know.
Yeah, I think we should just start with, the Ed Coyle paper. Michael Joyner. And because this kind of really does give a good intro. The whole paper is basically an intro to what is a predictor of performance, especially when we're talking about endurance, right? And it kind of lays everything out nicely there. So I got some notes on it that I took that I was like, oh yeah, this is key. I think people forget some of these things, and I'm sure you got some notes too on it.
Yeah. So I can just kind of jump into it. So it's, as coaches, we are always trying to, I think as like a good coach, you're always trying to understand your athlete and how to develop your athlete's physiology in order to maximize performance. So what Dr. Joyner and Dr. Coyle did was they, kind of took a big picture idea of what are like the three things, or what are, like the 3 to 5 things that we can actually measure that would predict performance. And what it comes down to is the maximal amount of oxygen consumption that your body can uptake and utilize during exercise. So that's called VO2 max. The lactate threshold, which is kind of like the balance point between sustainable and unsustainable exercise intensity and where that occurs. And then your efficiency. So how readily available or how well your body is at translating, say, oxygen utilization, so chemical energy, to actual physical or mechanical output, whether that's speed or power output.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that we're talking about here is physiological metrics, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people, when they talk about predictors of performance, they're actually measuring performance itself. Oh, my 10K time, my 5K time, my 800-meter repeat today. When you start getting into heart rate, lactate, and they're not the best, but even VO2, when we're starting to get into some of these more in-depth measures, these things are really starting to give you feedback of what physiologically you're gaining from, right? It's not a, right. You can be getting better at performance. Your performance can improve for several reasons outside of physiology. So these are really what they're trying to hone in on and say, is the athlete actually getting fitter at their sport, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's a super good distinction to make is if you're only measuring performance, that's just the outcome. And I can't remember who it was, but I think it was like Evan Pycon, basically had, a post on Instagram. Of course, he had a great post on Instagram, like always, where he was talking about, tests versus assessments. Assessments are what determine the underlying physiology and potential limiters of your individual physiology versus tests that give you performance metrics. If we just did tests all day, all we know is that someone's, functional threshold power is 200 watts. We don't know how strong their heart is. We don't know how well their muscle is extracting oxygen. So by looking at these physiological variables, we're actually able to craft a much more pointed training program and see over time how the body is responding to that.
Exactly. Response to the training is the big part. We're not guessing that they got better. We physically know their physiology got better.
Yeah. And I think too, like, let's just use VO2 max as kind of like the measurement is like, we know that with training VO2 max should go up, but if you're measuring that over time, then if it actually goes up or not. Like, it's not just like a guessing game anymore.
And what it's going up from, right? Like, this last few months of these intervals didn't really do much for my VO2 max. Have I tapped that out right now? Do I need to put it away for a while before I come back to it? Right. Or do I need to switch it to more of a sprint interval training with low respiratory? It's like, exactly, right? We got to,
go ahead.
So let's try and lay out here what Coyle and Joyner really took this model from. Like, where did they start at? Like, where did they come from to get to this point where, hey, we need to test these markers, like AV Hill, maybe some of these prehistoric exercise phys guys.
Yeah. So I can speak a little towards AV Hill, and then I'll let you talk more about like threshold concepts and those sort of things. But so back, turn of the century, 1925, famous now physiologist AV Hill started to recognize that there was kind of this like what would it be?
Performance curve.
Yeah, performance curve, right? Where you have at the, like from what is that in time? I'm trying to like look at
it.
It's
time. It's time and and speed.
Yeah. So you have this exponential kind of curve where speed, and then over time it kind of plateaus out. So the longer the distance, the flatter that curve gets. So he was like, okay, well, what differentiates, somebody like a sprinter versus like a marathon runner? And he really got into this idea of measuring oxygen consumption. And honestly, like the stuff that he was doing, he was just strapping a bag. I'm pretty sure strapping a bag to his back and going and running laps at different speeds.
Exactly.
And then he was able to analyze how much oxygen was actually used. And he was like, oh, for this intensity, this amount of oxygen, for this intensity, this amount of oxygen. And he was able to kind of place oxygen in, like the limelight of, oh, this is like actually very important and very related, to your performance. And then he noticed after a certain speed, your oxygen consumption kind of plateaus.
Yeah.
Which gives us this idea of maximal oxygen consumption. There is a certain exercise intensity where no matter how much harder we go, oxygen consumption plateaus. And it's that high point, which is now used as, maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good little history lesson there, because it kind of gives people an understanding that this isn't just some new thing that came up in a lab and, the early 2000s. They've been testing this for quite some time, and they've been testing animals too. Like the model of human performance in these curves with time and speed, or power and speed, these work the same in animals that they've tested as well, right? It's biology, and biology tends to follow these larger rules. So the concept of performance is not just limited. And this is actually a good topic to humans, because a lot of places I find things that I use in my own training and with others that I coach is things that I've gotten from different sports like dog racing and horse racing. And people wouldn't think to look there, right? But if you want to see the amount of money that's put into some of these horses, right? It's absolutely insane. So, and that's where all these drugs come from that you've seen come out of the Eastern Bloc. Like that's where literally everything has come out of, right? Is some of these like animal racing events is some of these crazy techniques are actually pulled from there because biology is biology, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that, because my partner's mom was a pretty high level dog sled racer for a long time. And,
really?
I every once in a while will pick her brain about stuff. And she's like, yeah, we were, training these dogs, and and she was like, yeah. And I noticed that, some dogs respond better to like the longer endurance training, and others, like the shorter, faster sort of stuff. And then, I would have to make sure that they recover enough and give them enough food. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, like she has no formal education in physiology, but because her dog could not tell her how she felt or they felt, and so she had to figure out what was the best way to actually train these animals. And it's just really interesting, because I think from that, I'm just like, wow, like, these physiological concepts of, we need to go like short and easy some days, or long and easy some days, or short and faster some days, like it still holds true if you want to train a sled dog, an elite level sled dog, or, if you want to train yourself. So that's really interesting.
It's funny because I'll dive into this right quickly, because I hope people like dogs and like talking about dogs for a second. But I have a duck toller, and he's hyper energetic, like he's insane. But the reason for that is actually because I built that into him. Mm-hmm. And with dogs, you can actually steer certain things like drive and prey drive and ball drive and these different things, food drive, right? Mm-hmm. And I've been training him since young. And actually, I used to have an obstacle course for him when he was younger to build this coordination and stuff like that, because a dog is just like a human. And this is a good topic that we should talk about in the future on the podcast is if certain capabilities and capacities aren't built at a young age, you will never reach the ability to hit the high highs of what we see in human performance, right? If you weren't out there like Kipchoge running 20 kilometers to and back from school every day, the chances of you being an elite marathon runner are going to be much lower than someone that has been doing that, you know, for 10 years when they're a kid. So it's the same thing with me and my dog. I would have him out there. I would do hard sprint days with him with the ball. So some days would be ball heavy and I would have him chase the ball. And these sessions were insane. And the thing with high drive dogs is they never know when to stop. Like I'll be throwing the ball for him for 40 minutes and he's sprinting nonstop for 40 minutes. We'll come inside. He'll just be sitting there whining to go back out again and do more. And then other days are long days, but watching how he's responded to that type of training over the years and when he needs a little bit more of the ball, when he needs a little bit more of, you know, some of the longer activities. And some days it's like, oh, I'm going to lay off the ball today because he's, you know, kind of dragging a little bit, but it's just interesting. Mm-hmm. Dogs are fascinating creatures.
Yeah. And so continuing on this tangent a little bit. So my partner is an amazing dog trainer, and I actually have one of them sitting next to me right now. She's a French shepherding dog, and she's pretty high drive. So we'll go to the park and I'll throw the ball to her pretty much until she's like ignores it. But for the most part, it's not her lack of interest, you know, that stops her. She's like, I can't actually run right now. Let me you know, lay down and take a break. And that's it's interesting because we as humans, right? We're like, oh my gosh, why is my dog overweight? Oh my gosh, why is my dog not fast? Like whatever. It's like, well, probably because you don't ever train your dog to be faster, to, you know, or you overfeed them, or you do that sort of stuff. And it's again, the exact same principles, right? For human performance development. And you need to start at a young age, and you need to continue, you need to be consistent, you know, over time. That's why these guys like, you know, from Kenya are so darn good. They're going 10 kilometers each way to and from school from the age of like, you know, from the time they're in kindergarten.
Exactly.
And then we wonder why they're so good. Oh, they must have, you know, some weird genetic predisposition to being good. It's like,
it's genetics.
No, they put in the work.
Exactly.
So I guess to dial us back, right? Like we were talking about VO2 max, which is one part of the puzzle, right? AVO2, that's a little different. AV Hill noticed that, you know, there was this plateauing of, you know, like, speed and those sort of things. And then he was like, oh, there's a plateau in VO2 max. Mm-hmm. On top of that, they started to recognize that, oh, maybe like it's not sustainable to exercise at VO2 max. So I can't remember exactly what happened, but somebody was doing, you know, some sort of research in like cows or something like that, and noticed that cows or animals, and correct me if I'm totally butchering this, but basically there's some sort of fermentation process that occurred when no oxygen was present. And there was this stuff called lactic acid that was starting to build up. So this idea that when oxygen is limiting, we would get this creation of lactic acid. And then, you know, it's kind of like, oh, well, maybe there's actually a VO2 that is correlated with the ability to, you know, keep that lactate. I'm going to call it lactate because that's actually what it is.
There we go.
Keep that lactate from actually accumulating within the blood, especially during, you know, during actual physiological exercise. So this is where this idea of lactate threshold started coming in. What is the maximal exercise intensity that we can sustain for a long period of time? And what is the surrogate, or what is like the measurement that indicates that tipping point between sustainable and unsustainable? And that's where we get lactate threshold from.
Exactly.
And just to clarify, lactic acid, lactate will be used synonymously, but just as a scientific argument, lactic acid doesn't ever exist in the muscle.
Yes.
It's typically as lactate.
Yes.
So just going forward, like let's get lactic acid out of our vernacular, and we can spend a whole podcast talking about lactate and
we definitely
misconceptions behind that. But I just wanted to clarify, I'm saying lactic acid because that's what they called it in the first studies, but it's actually lactate when it's in the human body, because of the biochemistry behind it. So
another point on that lactate too is you'll hear lactate threshold talked about quite a bit. And there is probably, I think there was close to 25 definitions of different lactate thresholds. But when we're talking about it, we're simply talking about a delineation in physiology. It could be the first lactate turn point or the second lactate turn point. Like, for example, in Ed Coil's and Joiner's paper, they described it as a first lactate threshold, I believe. And so if it's needed to be understood, like what threshold we're talking about, we will make sure to talk about LT1, LT2, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it doesn't really matter. It's more so giving you the concept that there is a physiological threshold here, and that's what they're trying to get to you at, right?
Yeah. There's a boundary.
Yeah.
And those threshold values are what's measuring that boundary, that tipping point between some change in your physiology that's going on.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's a super good clarification point, because I just made a post on my Instagram that was talking about, fatigue thresholds, and I call them fatigue thresholds just because it's like, okay, well, above this, you're going to fatigue, and below that, you should be able to, sustain it. But the different fatigue thresholds, there's different definitions and there's different measurement processes, and every single, like since lactate has been around for so long, like you said, there's 25 different measurements of it.
It's crazy.
And it gets a little, it gets a little confusing and challenging to actually read the literature because people don't use the same terminology over time. So, so as a big picture application point here, when we say lactate or fatigue threshold, all we mean is this, a boundary between, say LT1 might be the boundary between, changes to maximal fatty acid oxidation, where you start to rely more heavily on carbohydrate oxidation. Whereas LT2 is the point where we start to rely more on non-aerobic sources of fuel. So glycolysis, PCR, and we'll talk about those in the future. But that shift results then in metabolites building up that could then be perpetuating fatigue. So
exactly.
So thresholds are just delineations between different states in the body.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. So let's talk about, let's just kind of dig into this about one of the equations, which I really liked. Not that I use it, but it's funny because typically when you read through research, a lot of the times you'll get charts of performance or physiological markers of the individuals in that study. And what I like to do is, before I look at anything, I try and find who do I think from the physiological markers that are posted here is going to be the individual with the highest power, the best time for trial performance, or whatever the goal is, right? The best running speed. And generally, most of the time, through the physiology, you can pick out who are going to be in the top 3, who are going to be in the top 5. And so I think physiologists understood that, hey, it just seems that these certain physiological markers always correlate with performance. So one thing that they've done was they've made an equation for that. And one of them was the VO2 performance, which is essentially the VO2 max and the percentage of lactate threshold of that VO2 max. And then they times that by running economy, essentially. So this was something I found fairly interesting because I also seen it in the Nike Breaking 2 project. And it was similar to the equation that Andy Jones had, which was in one of the scientists that was a part of that project. And he had something called the 80-80-180 rule. And this is where for an athlete to break 2, they had to have certain characteristics, and three of the big ones were and VO2 max of around 80, right? And that's mils per minute per kg. And they had to have a first lactate threshold, first LT point, right, of 80% of that. And then they had to have a running economy of at least 180 mils per kg per kilometer, which is a different way of measuring running economy. It's not the traditional way, but this was something he used essentially to apply to the pool of athletes that they were testing and say, these are the kind of metrics we're looking for if we're going to break two. They don't have to be exact, but they definitely have to be in this ballpark, because if they're not, there's just no way this is going to be physically possible for a human.
Right. Like they won't even have the capability to even, run at the required oxygen consumption that is necessary to generate the amount of energy that is necessary to propel them 4 minutes and 35-ish seconds per mile for 26.2 miles.
Exactly.
Every time I say that, it just blows my mind that actually happened. I was a decent runner in like high school and then junior college, and my best mile ever, I say decent runner, and then everyone's gonna be like, no, he wasn't, was only 4 minutes and 41 seconds for like 1,600 meters. Yeah. And I was dead afterwards. I was absolutely just trashed afterwards for probably like 30 to 45 minutes after. I was like, I can't even move. And you know, then we have these guys, you know, who can maintain faster than that for 26 times that, which is
exactly. And that's the thing, when people think about these marathon runners, oh, these skinny guys, and it looks like they're moving relatively slow, right? But most athletes, I would go out there on a limb to say, most athletes couldn't hold that pace for 400 meters.
No,
most of them couldn't. I would go out there and say that on a limb, but it's absolutely insane, right? It's just trying to wrap your head around these speeds. Go out and try it on the treadmill next time you're out there. Just look it up. There's plenty of videos out there on the internet of people trying to hold Kipchoge's pace. It's good.
Yeah, if you think that, you know, these guys are going slow, go to a track, run 400 meters, and try to get under a minute and 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And let us know. Let us know how close you get.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because that's even, I'll tell you this, that's even slower than what they had to average to get a 2-hour marathon. So man, if I tried to do that right now, I'd die. It would be bad.
100% I would.
Yeah. Just to go back, just to kind of get back on the conversation, I think too, so what they're trying to explain, right, is that, or how I think about it is maximal oxygen consumption, right? Your VO2 max essentially determines how big your engine is. You know, how big is your aerobic engine? You have to have a prerequisite size in your aerobic engine in order to be, you know, have the potential for good performance.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, you have to have the ability to maintain, maintain cellular or body homeostasis. That's what's described by lactate threshold. Again, that tipping point between sustainable and unsustainable. They even go and add performance O2 deficit, or your anaerobic, non-aerobic performance. And they talk about total buffering capacity. So your body's ability, when that unsustainable portion of exercise is being reached, you're going to start to create more metabolites than can be dealt with within the muscle itself. And that proportion is not insignificant. So you need to be able to measure kind of that like non-aerobic gas tank. And then on top of that, it helps to be able to move efficiently. So being, you know, more like a Prius as opposed to a Ford F450, right, is super beneficial, especially for endurance performance, because the higher gas mileage you have, the further you can go on whatever gas tank is within your body. So all of those in combination was what was actually, you know, thought to predict performance. And interestingly enough, I think there might have been like maybe 1 or 2 papers before the paper that I published from my master's that actually looked at the ability for these performance markers to actually predict performance in a mathematical model. So that was kind of the impetus behind my master's thesis. We were just like, well, we actually want to know what is like the R² value for the combination of these 3 variables, the efficiency, the threshold, and VO2 max. So that was kind of a fun, concept to be able to tackle. And I think, I can't remember the exact numbers because I did my master's a few years ago now. But it was like, 92%.
Yeah, it was high.
It's crazy. Yeah. So those 3 variables in combination explained about 93% of the variance in time in cycling time trial performance between the group of athletes that we tested, which is insanely high. Like if you ever look at like R² values, like sometimes people get like 40% and they're like it's significant. We were showing like almost like, we only have 7% of that. That's unexplained through that, at least through that model itself.
No, these are great, great markers. And that's why they're used everywhere and every lab generally. They're a staple, especially when we're talking about endurance performance. And we should mention that we are talking about endurance performance. The amount of variables that come into play with team sports, yes, we do want to shift physiology in the positive direction for team sport athletes, but it's not necessarily going to guarantee pinnacle performance. Whereas with endurance performance, much more so. And this paper even talked about, which I thought was interesting, was when we were talking about economy and running versus cycling, they teased out that there's more variables when we're talking about even running than cycling. Cycling has pretty much the least amount of variables. And that's why cycling is the #1 go-to testing apparatus for any exercise phys, because you can literally measure the power that's going into the crank. You can measure everything in this stationary, small space with not having to worry about, are they losing, energy from tendon issues, right? They can't provide enough elasticity. Anyways, it's just cycling is very easy to control the variables. And this is what we want to do with anything when we're measuring performance. We're trying to control the variables at hand, limit them as much as possible so we can see how we're responding, like we talked earlier, to a training intervention, to rest intervention, to whatever.
Yeah, I think that hits the nail on the head with like, what's the best test? It doesn't matter what the best test is. Well, it matters what the best test is, but what's more important is the repeatability of the test over time.
Exactly.
Like it doesn't, say for instance, body composition, right, is a huge topic of debate. And within the research, everybody claims that DEXA scan is like the gold standard. And it's essentially because GE decided that DEXA scan was the gold standard, and then they made a product to measure that. But tongue in cheek aside, if you can't afford a $50,000 DEXA machine, but you can, go down the road to like, some nutrition shop or something that has a like an in-body bioimpedance scanner, and you went in 7 a.m. on a Monday with no water after, doing the same sort of fueling, sort of thing. That's going to be better than if you did like a DEXA scan, one time at 7 a.m. and then another time at, 10 p.m. at night, after drinking a buttload of water or eating something different or doing those sort of things. So the bottom line is that, we could argue, what's the exact best, test to do this, that, or the other. It's the one that's going to be the most repeatable for you. Especially for coaches, right? Like I always encourage people, like, have a testing protocol, and especially it's easier with like cyclists. It's always easier with cyclists, right? Because you can get them on a stationary bike, and you don't have to really go anywhere. But do the same protocol over time and see how things are changing over time. And so that was a little bit of a tangent, but I guess we didn't really talk about efficiency / economy. So I want to jump back to that just a little bit.
Let's do that.
So I already kind of defined it, but efficiency is basically the oxygen cost either for a certain speed or power output, more or less. And figure 6 really shows like a really good version of this. And what they found, what Dr. Joyner found, was that people who had the best, I think that's running economy, had the best running economy or efficiency generally had highest VO2 max and highest running speed that they could, maintain. And that makes sense, right? Because efficiency is defined by speed and oxygen consumption. So these elite level athletes who had the best running economy were faster for lower oxygen consumptions. If you have a lower oxygen consumption for a faster speed, that means that you're probably able to be below, or you're able to, it's less likely that you're above your fatigue threshold.
Yeah, exactly.
So efficiency plays a big role in, performance. However, from what I've seen, at least, efficiency is the hardest to train.
It is. And it's the hardest to study. And it's the hardest to study. How do we intervene with efficiency? Right. This is something that I think about a lot. Running economy, not as much as cycling economy, but running economy is a huge, huge problem in exercise physiology that's always constantly trying to be solved for. Why is one runner more efficient than the other? We have one runner over here that looks like he's, a yard sale, right? He's running, everything's everywhere. Nothing's where it should be. But for some reason, another runner with the same VO2 max, right, that has perfect, quote unquote, running biomechanics, has much poorer running economy. His running economy is nowhere near this guy that's running all over the place, sloppy, horrible technique. And one of the reasons this is such an interesting concept to me is because how do we study that? How do we study why is one runner more economical than the other? How do we study if certain running interventions, like changes in running technique, can make someone more economical? Because there's so many variables. Maybe their anthropometrics aren't meant for that type of running technique. Maybe the muscle balances they have in their body aren't meant for that running technique, but maybe they are for someone else. And then when you study that, it's really hard to tease out the details, right? Yeah. It's really, really hard to tease out the details. Everything running economy. So that's why you'll see a lot of mixed results when you read through the literature on running economy. And that's why they talk about in this paper, the variance is, up to 40% in runners versus cyclists, where it's more to 20 to 30%. Right. There's just so much to be had with running economy.
Yeah. And, people have tried, to see what explains changes in running economy. But like you said, it's really challenging because, is it based on your, fiber type composition, which seems to at least explain or is correlated, like there's some explanation and variability. They say about 1/2 of that variability is explained by type 1 fibers. But then on top of that, different cadences result in different economies and efficiencies. And something that I've done in the lab previously is we actually clamped people's cadence to 80 RPMs. And what we found is that's like selected or self-selected cadence was different than those 80 RPMs.
Yeah.
And I imagine if your body, especially when you're cycling, has a self-selected cadence of 60 or 110, right? You're
Mhm.
not going to be as efficient during that 80 RPMs as you would with, like your self-selected efficiency. But people would, you'd get absolutely skewered if you didn't control for RPM if you determined economy or efficiency during a study. So that's the challenge. And then on top of that too, like strength training has been shown to increase economy, make it better. But that would seem to kind of go in the face of it because it's heavy strength training, especially, that helps.
Exactly.
That could result in type 2 fiber recruitment and all this other stuff, which, type 2 fibers, like they're less oxidative. So they would they should be less efficient in a sense. So it's all of these crazy conundrums that go on when trying to measure efficiency.
Yeah, it's funny because this is something that I picked out in the Vander's Ward study. I believe it was him that was talking about the switching of recruitment from fiber types. Was it him that was talking about that? Or was that in the Coil study? I think it might have been the Coil study.
I don't remember exactly, but there was somebody who basically said that, people who are really efficient have the ability to selectively kind of cycle and recruit type 2 fibers.
Exactly. Yeah. So they're going through using different fibers within a given effort. So they're giving some of their fibers a break. And then once those fibers have had their break, they get turned back on again. And that's another thing that kind of works against the whole concept of strength training. Whereas strength training, you're trying to maximally recruit all your fibers. And this is something I do want to not have a podcast on, but talk about it. The future point is, for example, if you're trying to do a push-up, right? Do you want all your muscle fibers contributing to that push-up or just the amount that is needed? Well, if we're trying to do an endurance exercise, if we use all our muscle fibers, we're probably maximally contracting, cutting off blood flow, wasting energy that we don't need because we only need to push the body up. We don't need to push 300 pounds up. And I went down this rabbit hole as a kid trying to figure out, how do I train to get the most push-ups possible, right? How do I get this number? And I went down so many wrong paths trying to find this golden hair that everyone searches for in the Army. But it's just interesting because running economy, we really don't know, the nuts and bolts mechanisms of what is steering it. I'll mention this though, for coaches out there, there is a really good free software you can get that Lizzie Moore created. She's a biomechanics researcher, a really good one of the best in the world. And she put out this free software that you can find online where you can have a runner run on a treadmill at a specific cadence, and then you plug in their heart rate or SMO2 data, and it'll actually calculate their efficiency, like the efficiency of those selected cadences, to see, hey, does this cadence actually suit a runner better compared to this cadence? What she found was that most runners actually are running within 3 to 4% of their, optimized cadence. And the better the runner, the closer that number is going to be. Like it's going to be 1 to 2%. A newer runner, you're going to see somewhere out to 8 to 10%. But that is just a note about that software because it's actually really good and I use it. So
yeah, that is really cool. I think if we're going to the applied side of things, I think again, where efficiency could actually be useful is, with like say a new athlete who's trying to determine what is the most efficient cadence for me. And then doing the same, like power output at different cadences and then seeing, what is the actual oxygen cost of that or energy cost or heart rate, even heart rate would be perfect in this, right? Because heart rate would just,
simple.
If you have a lower heart rate for the same power output at a higher cadence, you probably want to do that, right? That's, all this stuff is super interesting. And actually, to go back to the, how do I get the most, the most push-ups possible? So, I've always been a very big believer that and of course, this is going to be highly inter-individual, but the stronger you are, the the lower the percentage of performance, right? You know, in any given, like say push-up task is, say you can bench press, you know, 500 pounds. That percentage of your max, this is like, you know, taking these equations and moving them more towards like, you know, strength endurance training. The stronger you are, say 500 pounds, which is an incredibly high bench press, doing one push-up is like, you know, 20% of your 1 rep max.
Yeah.
So then from that perspective, you know, you would be using less muscle fibers. You would be, it's the same, you know, same energy cost.
Yeah.
But and then of course you have to get into like, you know, like fatigue threshold. So you'd have to actually practice doing, you know, 100 push-ups in a row. But like the maximal strength is super important because it inherently reduces the relative value of the exercise intensity that it actually is.
Yeah.
The stronger you are.
Exactly.
And I think especially with like runners and cyclists, since we're so scared about getting bulky. I say that sarcastically, but there's a lot of people, if you ask them, they're like, man, I've been putting my arms in slings because I want to atrophy the muscle as much as possible.
I'm sorry.
It's crazy. Like everything to reduce, you know, weight. But if you just got stronger, then you would reduce the actual percentage of energy, or, you know, the percentage of energy cost that's actually going on. So, and I think go ahead. No, I was going to say, I think a lot of runners, especially why they benefit from heavy strength training is because you have that neurological component that will have you go from, you know, only being able to squat 50 pounds to like 150 in the course of, you know, 8 weeks, maybe. You don't even get any hypertrophy benefits from that.
You don't get any. That's the thing. That's exactly what I was actually going to say, was like these runners, a lot of people in endurance training think they're going to get jacked from lifting weights. Number one, lifting weights doesn't work like that. First of all, it's like it takes a lot of effort to gain muscle lifting weights. Second of all, the amount of endurance training you're doing, the blunting of hypertrophy is just going to be so excessive from the volume that these athletes are doing. You're just not going to gain or hold any muscle mass, any that would actually detract from performance.
Yeah.
Like, you know, we're talking about into the 4 or 5 pound territory, right? Like 3, 4, 5 pounds. That's just, it's most likely not going to happen. The benefits are neurological, especially if you're staying in these kind of shorter rep ranges or doing these kind of high intensity efforts, whether it's isometrics or things like that. This is a huge benefit. And running fast is a neurologically heavy endeavor, right? It's more so that when we talk about sprinting than it is a bioenergetics endeavor, right? A lot of it is neurology. The ability to send the signal down fast, clean, hard, and the ability to inhibit muscles quickly. And that's neurology as well. That has nothing to do with force, right? How fast you can relax a muscle, reciprocal inhibition, that is neurology. So these are some of the benefits, especially like, you know, Olympic lifting, explosive lifts, turning the muscles on fast, turning them off fast.
I was going to say, if we're, you know, still talking about efficiency here, right? Like if you can turn the muscle on faster and release it, or, you know, turn it on and off faster, then that muscle isn't actively demanding ATP as long. So then from there, you can kind of start to back calculate, oh, maybe since it's being turned on and off, you know, so quickly, the demand for ATP is lower. If the demand for ATP is lower, the amount of oxygen that's being consumed is lower. And then therefore oxygen consumption for any given task is going to be lower as well. And I don't know of any studies that have actually, you know, looked at that specifically. But just from like an integrative physiologist approach, that's like where my brain is like, oh, there could be an explanation for this. So the bottom line is if you don't lift weights and if you don't lift kind of heavy and fast, as a runner, a cyclist, any sort of endurance athlete, you would probably have a lot of benefits to your performance from that. And most likely it's the performance benefits are going to come from an increase in efficiency. So, and final side note, if like, so I've been an endurance athlete, since junior high. So I don't even know what age that is, but 8th grade. And then I got really into lifting and all of that. And I swear, if strength training did what all of the endurance and running community actually thought it would do, I'd be 200 pounds and I'd be jacked.
Yeah, exactly.
So don't think of strength training as this thing that's going to make you bulky. Think of it as something that is actually beneficial to your performance.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
So what do you want to do next here? Do you want to touch on the Vandersward, or do you want to?
I think we're kind of at a good wrapping up point.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because it'd be we would only be able to touch on it because we wouldn't really.
Yeah.
And that's actually good. It'll save. Actually, no, I'll leave us with this. This is the next study that we're going to talk about in the next episode, which is, this will kind of leave us with something cool. Was I found this piece of research, which is it's basically on muscle fibers and endurance performance predictors, kind of. And I was reading it somewhere around 9 o'clock at night, and I generally don't like to read research that late because my brain is just not firing optimally. And if I do get interested in it, then my dopamine is jacked up and I'm not going to sleep. So I'm like going to bed, like, thinking for 5 hours about these, it's all connected, right?
Right.
Everything. But I was reading through this and I was like, Julia, this is an amazing paper. I can't believe I'm reading this right now. This is one of the best papers I've read in forever. And I just kept going through and I was looking at all the references. And then I seen Batterson and all. And I was like, wait, is that Phil Batterson?
Yeah.
Is that seriously him? And then I went and looked in the references. I'm like, are you kidding me? And he's got a reference in this paper.
Yeah.
So our very own Phil here has been referenced in one of the best papers I've read this year for sure.
Yeah.
And it's a great paper. We're going to dive into it next week. But this is what was the impetus for me actually reaching out to Phil and being like, I have to now. I have to reach out to the guy and get something together with this, because this is super cool. This is really interesting. He's doing good work.
Yeah. Hey, I really appreciate that. And just to give people a little bit of a teaser. So this review paper that Steven Vandersward did kind of is a culmination of a lot of his work, where he has looked at, these predictors of performance. And then on top of that, the new wrinkle that we're adding is essentially performance is more or less driven by what's going on within the skeletal muscle. And my overarching academic hypothesis is that not only is it happening in the skeletal muscle, but I think that a lot of things are driven and dictated by the skeletal muscle mitochondria. And we'll get into that later. But it's super interesting stuff. And it's really cool that people are starting to appreciate and talk about, just how important, just like all of the interactions with the skeletal muscle are, and how it's not just, just for contraction anymore. It's actually dictating a lot of the things that we see with performance, and we can go from there.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So that was a good summary on the first paper and kind of predictors of performance and endurance, exercise, and sport. We covered basically the big three, right? VO2 max, lactate threshold, economy, the big ones, why they're useful, what's the difference between physiological performance and actual performance on the track, right? Math versus, physiology, essentially. We've went in depth a little bit on the history. We talked about how do we apply some of these things, right? Do we test after a training block, right? Where we might actually see how we responded to that training. We touched on a lot. So we're going to continue with this subject for the at least next episode for sure. And that's pretty much all we have for today.
Yeah. And just for those of you probably found us via social media, but if you don't know us on social media, my Instagram handle is critical02. And if you have any questions about any of this sort of stuff, please reach out to me, shoot me a DM with questions, comment on any of the other pictures and stuff, because I've covered a lot of this stuff in depth. And that's our goal, is to help coaches understand the physiology so we can make better athletes out of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. I have a new Instagram account that is just boatloads of followers by the day. I really can't, I'm going to have to probably shut it down because it's taking up too much of my time, but I'm back on the social media again, begging for more. And if you want to go throw me a follow, I put up some videos there, some clips of stuff from my YouTube channel that I just started. And that's at Resilience HPC on Instagram. And I have the pretty much same handle on YouTube, so you can find me on there as well.
Awesome. Until next time, thanks, guys. Appreciate you listening.
Peace.